So we're recording this late morning on Thursday, which is important because we now officially have the news that Donald Trump has been elected the next president of the United States. First off, I just want to ask you a bit more about sort of personally how you guys spent the day yesterday, what the vibe was in Parliament House in Canberra. Were you talking to people? You know, what you were in the sort of centre of politics in Australia. What was the reaction there?
Look, I think that the result is cataclysmic on lots of fronts. I think the broad expectation from, majority of politicians, be they coalition or Labor, was that it was going to be close and that probably Harris was going to get across the line. But I think we're all now used to the fact that the polls are increasingly unreliable. And this is the case in this instance. Rory Stewart, I heard him on Sunday night. He was down here in Canberra, and he was talking about polls and pollsters were accommodating expectations of each other and fluffing their own figures up or down according to this herd mentality. So, yeah, I just didn't know who was going to win. Having been in California a few weeks ago, even that confused me. Democrat state, but there were still people in the shops and bars and streets who were really fed up with the state of play in America, both with the grime, the crime, and the general sense of uncertainty when it comes to cost of living.
Yeah. David, what was your sort of impression as you walked around the halls of Parliament House yesterday?
I thought Andrew just nailed it there with that word. It is a cataclysmic outcome, but it didn't feel cataclysmic in Parliament House as the results came through. In question time, for instance, all the politicians were looking at their phones. There was a simple question where Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton both said the relationship is so strong with the United States and it will be strong regardless of who wins the election. And they were really hesitating to really talk much about the outcome even as the results came through, and they stared at their phones trying to digest what they could see.
Let's talk about the implications for Australia now. Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton have both put out statements publicly congratulating Trump on his victory. I think Albanese had a conversation briefly with Trump on Thursday morning. But what do you think they were saying privately? What was the sort of vibe within the government about how well an Albanese government would get along with the Trump administration?
I think the biggest consideration at the moment is what does it do to the economy? The economy is everything when you're within 6 months of an election, especially when a government is so keen on bringing down inflation and enticing the Reserve Bank to bring down interest rates. Now, if you have the spectre of a trade war with China starting January 7, say, that means Australia gets wrapped up in that almost immediately, because if a trade war with China between the US and Washington and Beijing results in China going into a downturn, that means they need less iron ore, less coal, less gas. This is big bucks for Australia. We are sandwiched between having this being reliant on our security with the United States and then being reliant on China because they are our biggest trading partner. And it's that unhappy space is going to cause a whole lot of discomfort, and it now comes down to powers of persuasion and diplomacy to ensure that the sharpest and nastiest bits of a trade war with China don't hurt us.
David, what's your take on that? What are the sort of problem areas under another Trump administration for Australia? And are there some positives as well?
It's hard to see any positives right now. Clearly there is going to be tension between the Albanese government and the Trump administration on tariffs because Trump has a stated plan to impose tariffs. They cause a lot of economic damage, including to Australia. There's the fact that Donald Trump wants to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement on climate change. That plays havoc with global policies on climate and then gives rise to the argument inside Australia about why the government is imposing costs on industry with an emissions target that Donald Trump is, having no part of.
Yeah.
And then there's also the AUKUS Defence Pact, where there are questions over how much Australia is spending on it and whether we can rely on the United States to honour their side of the defence deal on supplying nuclear-propelled submarines. Now, not all of this can really wreak havoc on Anthony Albanese's government and his election campaign before the election. If we look at the timeline, there's a lot that we'll be hearing from Donald Trump between now and January 20, which is Inauguration Day. But let's say he goes forward with tariffs straight away. Then you've got that window between January to whatever the Australian election date is, where you're being buffeted by Trump all the time while fighting a domestic campaign. And that's going to be pretty wild. But that's just everybody heading into the unknown next year.
On AUKUS, though, I think, Jackie, it's important to remember that this is still a pretty good deal for the United States. We are throwing billions of dollars at the United States defence industry to build subs, to build their own subs, to be quite frank. It might be that we end up subsidising only US subs because they don't have to hand them over, because the president of the day can say, sorry, we are underprepared in our own defence. But I don't think AUKUS is going to be trouble there, but it is those other issues that become problematic for a government that wants to talk about being ambitious on climate change. That's where the air is really going to start leaving the balloon.
I mean, with respect, haven't you contradicted yourself a little bit there by saying that AUKUS isn't going to be a problem? Maybe it's not a problem in the short term for an Albanese government or a Dutton government, but in the long term, if there's a prospect that we don't actually get the submarines because the Americans hang on to them themselves, isn't that kind of the whole point of the deal for us, that we get submarines?
Yeah, but we're talking there like late 2030s.
Right.
So it's not a big deal at the moment.
Yeah.
And it is one that's going to have to be negotiated, and it's going to be one that will require a lot more effort from Australia.
I think there's a live debate to be had about AUKUS in the light of the election, the presidential election. And that's why I talked to Bob Carr and Gareth Evans, former Labor foreign ministers, and critics of AUKUS in the wake of the outcome. And put that up as a story on Thursday morning, because I think it is a debate now. The US may not want to give us Virginia-class nuclear-propelled submarines in the 2030s, as we're expecting under AUKUS, and that's because of pressures on the US military, pressures on the US Navy. So that is a debate to have about whether we're heading in the right direction with AUKUS and whether we're going to have to reconsider it. It would not surprise me in the least if Donald Trump one day said to Anthony Albanese, I don't have a problem with AUKUS, but Australia's only contributing $4.7 billion to our industrial might here. I think you better increase your investment. There's a lot of unknowns still to work through between the Australian government and the Trump administration.
Yeah. Probes, do we know anything about the relationship between the Albanese government specifically and the Trump team? Has there been has there been any contact? Has there been reach out apart from this call on Thursday morning?
Well, what we do know is that Kevin Rudd has been working furiously in the past few months to realise some kind of connection. We know that Penny Wong and Richard Marles have, for example, spoken to Mike Pompeo, and Mike Pompeo will play a big role, we expect, in the next Trump administration. Mike Pompeo is supposedly a big supporter of AUKUS, for example. So there has been a lot of work by Kevin Rudd and others in his orbit to make those connections, and both sides of politics have actually acknowledged Kevin Rudd's work there, notwithstanding the fact that he has had some choice words to say about Donald Trump, particularly after January 6.
And we should also note that on Thursday morning, Rudd put out a statement saying that he had officially wiped the record of all of the previous statements that he's made that have been critical of Trump, which he said was out of respect for Trump having been elected the president again. It's a very Rudd move, I think, to put out a statement about how you're wiping all your previous statements. But be that as it may, Crowe, what do you think the relationship will be like between an Albanese government and a Trump administration? They're not exactly simpatico ideologically, are they?
No, they're not. And so it's going to be a rocky relationship. There's just no way to get around that. They're coming at issues from different directions on so many fronts that there ends up being tension. And we already know from the first Trump presidency that he's not particularly inclined to make life easy for allies. And so I think we'll see that again. We'll see that in the region and we'll see that in the world. And Anthony Albanese will have to deal with that. But I don't think that means that it's necessarily bad politically for Anthony Albanese. I just want to be cautious on this point. I'm not saying it's good either. Volatility out of Washington, D.C. can cause a lot of pain for the Australian Prime Minister. It's quite possible for Donald Trump to chip away at Anthony Albanese as he has at other allies in the past. But we do have one example from the recent past where we know how things play out. Remember that leak of the transcript between Donald Trump and Malcolm Turnbull when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister. This was in 2017. And Donald Trump just ripped into Malcolm Turnbull, and then the Washington Post released the transcript. And it was fascinating reading. But also inside the Turnbull Prime Minister's office at that time, they didn't see it playing out badly for Malcolm Turnbull politically.
No,
because
quite
he
the
was
opposite.
he did play it fierce and hard against Donald Trump.
So the mistake here is to be craven towards Trump and to think that you've got to appease Trump. That's actually not what you've got to do. And we have Australian history that tells leaders here what to avoid. So if Anthony Albanese learns from that experience, then the answer will be to hold firm on Australian policies, regardless of what Trump may tweet.
On that, I mean, I don't know if it's even possible to answer this question, but let's try anyway. Is Trump in the White House, when we cast forward to our own next election, is Trump in the White House likely to help Labor win the next election again, or Dutton and the coalition win the next election?
That's a really tremendously difficult question to answer. I suppose the key to that will be how much of the Trump playbook does Dutton take. But you can't look at the Trump presidency or Trump himself as being a Republican. He kind of isn't. He has got the grand old party to surrender itself to him. So it is a party that is utterly contained within his grasp, and therefore every major decision is going to be made by Trump. So you can't, for example, there is no go-to playbook or for Dutton, but he might want to play with some of those anti-woke themes that we hear and have heard from Dutton over the past couple of years. There is that. I think that notwithstanding what people think about these things, there's definitely a bit of there's a reaction against political correctness, as we once called it, the idealism over practicality tussle. That is Trumpism to some degree. That is what Elon Musk is constantly railing against. And I think that will be the temptation for Dutton. But at the same time, the grand gift that we have as our Commonwealth is compulsory voting. That really does drag everything back into the centre, and it drags everything into the lounge room and everyone's dinner table.
David, tell me what you think about that, because whether or not taking elements of the incredible success of Trump as a political juggernaut, taking elements of that and importing them into Australia, is that a winning strategy for the coalition? We saw that play out a little bit with the abortion debate in the Queensland election, and then Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, the coalition senator, has tried to bring that into the federal sphere. But Dutton had something to say about that this week, didn't he, at least privately?
Yeah, and I think that highlights the fact that Peter Dutton can't take an American recipe book and cook up a storm in Australia just by taking one from one place to another, because we are such a different country. When we asked Australian voters who they'd back in the US presidential election, 52% said Kamala Harris. So copying the Trump playbook won't work for Peter Dutton here, but harnessing the frustration about the cost of living and harnessing frustration about migration is working for Peter Dutton and will continue to work. And in a sense, the coalition can be heartened by the Trump outcome, because it showed that on the cost of living and on migration, those big issues were working against the Democrats and they were working for Donald Trump. That's what Peter Dutton wants to repeat here. But as you mentioned, abortion was such an interesting issue this week because it got onto the US election agenda and the Democrats thought it was working for them. They went very hard on it. And then, of course, what we've seen in Australia is that it came up in the Queensland state election, and then Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, the Northern Territory senator with the coalition, said she was opposed to late-term abortions. She told our colleague Paul Sakal that in our mastheads in recent weeks. Peter Dutton told the Coalition Party Room on Tuesday morning that hurt them. He didn't name Senator Nampijinpa-Price, but he mentioned the fact that abortion worked against the LNP in Queensland, and he reminded everybody to be disciplined and not make it a federal issue.
Yeah.
Now, some federal politicians still want it on the agenda, but they're in the minority, and the coalition knows it's a toxic issue to introduce into the federal campaign. But it's pretty clear that Labor knows that if they can find a way to work it into federal debate, it can work against the coalition. So watch out for that to emerge during the federal campaign.
Jackie, I think it's also important to note that there are some limited lessons from what happened in the United States for another reason that we haven't mentioned, and that is the underlying sexism and misogyny that it was at the heart of some of the Trump argument, and that has affected the politics on both sides. I think it didn't work in favour of Harris in the end. I think she, as a candidate, she was ill-formed. We didn't know enough about her. She didn't have enough time to present herself. It became about who she was, and we know his flaws and grotesque elements of the Trump persona, but we didn't know enough, I think, or the American voter didn't know enough about Kamala. She wasn't given enough time, and even missing just that the Democrat convention where you argue candidate against candidate. That's a great opportunity to present yourself.
We've got so much to talk about, but I just want to add something there because it's been on my mind since the results came through. I watched Kamala Harris's last speech, also Donald Trump's last speech in the campaign. Kamala Harris spoke well, spoke about freedom, spoke about the importance of this election to democracy. She had Oprah Winfrey backing her up. She had Lady Gaga performing on stage. But I got to the end of her speech and I did not know what she was offering if I was an American worker worried about inflation and worried about my wage.
Yeah.
And I thought, in retrospect, that was such a reminder that in Australia, as in America, it's going to be about the cost of living. Those other big grand themes can do a little bit for you, but they can't win it for you. We've just seen that. It's the cost of living.
Yeah, and I think we're on a bit of a unity ticket there in the sense that the economy and immigration are always going to be top of mind issues for Australian voters too, I think. Just quickly before we finish, the RBA made an interest rates decision this week. We kind of missed it in all the other stuff that was going on. They left rates on hold. I just want to talk to you both about how that will impact the election timing, because that's all we're talking about now, right? Albanese government is clearly moving to an election campaign sort of footing. It's going to happen in the next few months. They'll probably call it. What do you think? How do you think the rates decision plays into election timing? Probes.
Well, I think everything has changed in the past 24 hours. So the return of Trump actually complicates things greatly. Stephen Kennedy's mob, he's the Treasury Secretary. They've already been looking at what the impact of trade restrictions would be. He says it would inevitably lead to lower growth and higher inflation. And with those ingredients, interest rate cuts might be a long way off. So we're dealing with a different world now, Jackie, because from January onwards, things will change both for us in a trading sense as well as diplomatically. And those two elements feed into the economy, both with consumer sentiment and actual activity in ships and trades. So, look, I reckon interest rates cuts have to be taken out of the equation now.
Right.
Anthony Albanese has to find some other way of enticing people and encouraging people to support him for another shot at prime ministership.
Crowe, what do you think the sort of the interest rate stuff does to election timing?
And they have to come up with a compelling cost of living package without assuming an interest rate cut. That means more energy bill relief, which is subject to debate, but I think they'll probably go there again. But on interest rates, I remember talking to a cabinet minister a few months ago who assumed that they'd have to go to the election without an interest rate cut. I've talked to others who were kind of assuming that there'd be one or two before the election, and I think that prospect is now dimmed. They've got to get ready to go to the polls with something that they can offer on their own rather than assuming the RBA is going to help them out.
Yeah. You don't always get to choose your own timing in life, right?
Yep.
Fellas, thanks so much. Probes, it was such a pleasure to have you. Can we have you back on again?
You certainly can.
Thanks, guys.
Good on you. Cheers.